Hi, I'm Cami Croft. I'm the Director of New Media here at the Department of Energy. As part of Energy Awareness Month, for the past few days, we've solicited questions from you, the public, via Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and email about energy conservation and efficiency. And I'm very pleased to be here today, joined by Secretary of Energy, Dr. Steven Chu, to get you some answers to some of your top questions. To get started, here at the department, Mr. Secretary, we know that you're a bit of an energy efficiency buff. So can you start off by actually talking about what you do to conserve energy at your home?
Well, the first thing I do, and it's been a long time in the making, it's not since I became Secretary of Energy, but over every home that I've owned, beginning when I was in my early 30s, we'd move in. The first thing I would do is I'd go to the hardware store, buy insulation, and roll out more insulation. And I'm very proud to say that in all these homes, we have been, except one, which was very well built, reduced the energy bill by at least a factor of 2.
Wow.
All right.
So insulation.
Insulation, leaky doors and windows, it's like blocking and tackling, the most important thing.
Great. So one of the questions, we got a lot, but I think at BetaSource on Twitter, I think says it best. How do I know whether or not I'm a good candidate for a home energy assessment?
Well, we actually have tools in the Department of Energy that you can click on, and then they can do an informal, tell us your house, how many windows, these things, how much you're spending on an energy bill, where's the house located, and it can actually tell you and guide you on what you need to invest in. What are the first things you should be investing that saves the most amount of energy and the most amount of money?
And actually thinking on what somebody should do first, Jerry, and apologies, Jerry, if I don't say your last name correctly, Laparoff, on Facebook, he says, my drafty old North Berkeley house has every imaginable shortcoming one can imagine in terms of energy efficiency. Drafty windows, cold coming up through the floors from the basement, a second-story bedroom with 4 exposures and large windows on 3 sides, et cetera, et cetera. So only the attic, he says, is over the main story, has been insulated. So he has electric usage. He wants to get his electric usage down to under $25 per month. He wants to know any idea on what he should tackle first?
I think get rid of the drafty leaks in the home. That is the clearest, biggest leak in any place. And so find out, try to figure out how to measure those drafts. It turns out your hands are very good measures of where it's drafty.
It's simple, it's easy.
And just go around and, again, there are many tools online. There are many places where you can get information on the best way to stop those leaks.
Great. We got this question about cool roofs, white roofs, green roofs, in a couple of places, especially on Facebook. Kate, Judah, and Scott Williams all asked, they wanted a little bit more information about the specifics of white roofs, if rooftop gardens really improve heating and cooling, and what are some of the cooling costs during summer associated with cool roofs?
Well, so the first thing to recognize is they do really matter, especially if you're in a warm place where you have a lot of air conditioning. And they don't have to be white. There are so-called cool colors that reflect heat in the infrared part of the radiation, but actually look like standard roofs. I think the thing to do, though, is to consider, because we want energy savings to be money savings. And
okay.
So when you buy a new home, you can consider what kind of roof. You may not have a choice. When you're re-roofing, you certainly have a choice in the type of roof. There are other things, paints that go on. I think you should stay away from those because the roofing material has to be an integral part of the roof, but they certainly save air conditioning. If you're in the bottom half of the United States where you have air conditioning bills, it could be 10-15% of electricity costs on air conditioning. Tremendous amount.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So I feel like a lot of our questions that we got were from homeowners, but what about renters? At Jessie DG on Twitter, she asks, how's a renter to convince her landlord to weather strip for energy efficiency tax credits that don't necessarily apply to rentals?
That's a tough question. And what I think one has to do is to give an incentive to a landlord. Now, if you ask, is there any incentive for landlord to dig into their pocket to do things when they're not paying for the energy bill? And I think one of the things is we have to socialize this. And so one possible incentive is, as someone who's renting, you might want to ask, what was the energy bill of the previous renter? Ask the renter. If you ask those things, we can look for mechanisms to encourage landlords to make the added investments, but this is what what the economists call a principal agent problem. You know, if the landlord isn't paying for the energy bill, they're not induced to make energy improvements. If the landlord pays for the energy bill, then the occupant is not, they can leave the air conditioning on and the window open.
I may have done that in college.
Oh, shame on you. So we have to get, the first thing is you want responsible behavior from the tenants. They can do a lot, but they're paying for the energy bill. And I think if all the tenants went to the landlord and asked in a very nice way, this will be good for you. And if you can actually have a record of what the energy bills are, that will be an incentive. A new tenant, when I buy a home, first thing I look at are the energy bills in the last year of the home. So I get a sense for what's the condition of the home. Of course, it doesn't fold in the fact that maybe the previous tenants wanted their home warm, 80 degrees in the winter, but you can ask them that, or what temperature they wanted in the summer, but you do get a sense for which homes are more energy efficient than others.
So ask your landlord and then communicate.
And
with your
communicate,
landlord.
and I think more and more landlords are getting onto the idea that it's the environmentally right thing to do. They should start to market their apartments if they have newer and more energy efficient apartments, and if they put in energy efficient appliances like refrigerators, use that as a marketing tool for the more progressive landlords and say, look, you rent this place, we just put in a new energy efficient refrigerator, your electricity bills will be much lower than the average out there, and let them be proactive.
So it becomes a renter's incentive.
Right.
To find an apartment that has these tools.
That they can market their apartment as more energy efficient, and so the utility bills will be less.
Great. So this question comes in from Facebook. Barbara Walks, she asks, what saves more energy and water? Washing dishes by hand or using an Energy Star dishwasher?
Oh, no comparison. You use a dishwasher. Scrape the dishes, even extensive rinsing. I think many people feel that the dishes have to be semi-clean before you put it in the dishwasher. The modern dishwashers don't even need that. And then fill it up to the brim. There is no comparison between washing dishes, even the most energy efficient way where you have a tub of hot water and you put them in there and then you have to rinse one by one. Much more energy savings. It doesn't even have to be an Energy Star dishwasher. It's so little. There's no comparison.
It's a big endorsement for dishwashers.
And it saves water, it saves energy, and you don't get dishpan hands.
Yes. So via email, Scott Wilson, he asks, is it more cost effective for homeowners to install solar PV panels to make electricity or to install a solar thermal system to make hot water?
That's a toughie, and I can't really say. It really depends on the particulars where the home is located. I think there are also new technologies coming out, sort of hybrid solar, heat pump, solar heaters. And I think before you start asking those questions, look at the vast things of what you need to replace. Is it just a hot water heater, or maybe a hot water heater and a burner? Because there are heat pump hot water heaters that are going to be saving a lot of money. There will be hybrid heat pump hot water solar. So it really depends on the area. Again, there are a lot of tools now on the internet where you can start clicking around to get a sense of how much money you will save either this way or that way, how much, what the payback period will be as well.
Great. This kind of switches gears a little bit. Pamela Logan on Facebook, she asks, or she says, I'd like to persuade my boyfriend to turn off his computer and other electronics when not in use because they make the apartment too hot in the summer. Can you give me some idea of what the heat output of a typical desktop computer is, or how much cooling power it takes to counteract?
Well, it depends on his computer if he's a gamer. So he has a computer that does high-performance video games. It could be 200 or 300 watts, but typically an average computer might be 100 watts when it's on. And even if it has a pretty energy-efficient screen. So there's the screen, there's the central processor of the computer itself, there's all the speakers, everything else. And sometimes you don't want to turn off the computer because it takes 3 minutes to turn it off in a real shutdown, and a couple of minutes to turn it back on. And so, and again, if you're a gamer, you certainly want to do this, but you might lose your game. So I think there are alternatives. There's other modes. A hibernate mode, instead of a full shutdown, takes far less time to shut down and bring up. There's far less probability of the computer actually getting stalled, because in today's computer, let's say with a Windows system, sometimes the computer actually crashes when it's trying to shut down.
Yep.
And so in a hibernate mode, you go from 100 watts to a small fraction of a watt.
So it's a good compromise rather than turning off completely.
There's another compromise, which is still about a factor of 100. That might be 1,000 times more energy efficient, 100 times more efficient. It's called the sleep mode. This one takes seconds to turn off, literally a couple of seconds, and a couple of seconds to turn on. So you can really think if you want to stop, eat dinner, but go back to your computer, put it in sleep mode. It's 100 times less energy, and with hibernate will still take a minute. Sleep mode, seconds.
And you really don't lose any time.
Yeah, you lose essentially no time. Nothing, sleep, it leaves all the stuff on the hard disk as it is. It turns off a few essentials, the screens, a few other things, hard disks, something like that. But it still saves a lot of energy.
Great. This question comes from Facebook as well. Dave Stevens. He says, I'm currently studying energy at JMU. The house I live in has no central heating system. My room has 8 windows that will undoubtedly transfer a lot of heat outside unless I prevent it. He's anticipating a very cold winter, and the heating device that he's using is a 1500W plug-in radiator. And he asks, what is the most efficient way to insulate the windows in my room given my circumstances? And he's not opposed to completely covering some of the windows for better insulation.
I think if it depends on the windows, but they're just good curtains. You know, heavy curtains that are, and you can actually buy curtains or shields that actually come down, but just, or a combination of curtains and a shade can do wonders. So just the idea of if you've just got simple pane glass windows, you know, he's renting?
He's renting.
Okay.
College student.
College student. So renting, he's not going to put in curtains. You might try to convince...
You may go to a fabric store and get some fabric that can serve as curtains.
Yes. And that can be, you know, I've done that, where...
Might not look as good.
Yeah. Well, it depends on how fashionable the student wants to be, but certainly that. Or very inexpensive shades, or try to convince the landlord to put in those things. Because shades and curtains, actually, they're good in the winter because they keep the heat in. And in the summertime, when the sun's shining through, again, I don't know where the place is, actually blocking sunlight coming in to keep the house cool also keeps a lot of sun bleaching from happening. So the landlord would actually be motivated. But things like that, then, you know, there's all sorts of other things. There's this little foam that you buy that's 1/4 inch or 3/8 inch thick in art stores. There's white, very light, you know. You can put, if you know, it's not completely ugly, it's white. There's no color.
Like fabric from a fabric store would be completely ugly.
Yeah. So there are many options like that.
Great. So to wrap things up, this might be a little tough. From Facebook, Clayton Bedwell asks, can you articulate in one sentence the importance of home energy efficiency in changing the clean energy landscape?
Homes in America use more than 20%, more than 1/5 of all the energy we use. I think, just from my own personal experience, without doing a real deep makeover, if I can reduce energy bills by a factor 2, that's a 10%. If everyone did that, that's a 10% decrease in the amount of energy we consume and the amount of carbon dioxide we produce. You can do better than that if you want to spend real money, okay? And so it's an incredible amount. Buildings in general are 40% of all the energy use. New buildings can be built and new homes can be built that use 4 times less energy. So that's a 30% decrease in our carbon emissions of things that will make money. So this is something we feel very strongly about in the Department of Energy. That was not one sentence, but the first sentence was the right one.
Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary. I know that our audience out there really appreciates you taking
Okay.
the time to answer some of these questions. Until next time, stay tuned and stay up to date with us on energy.gov.
And thank you for listening and being interested in saving energy, and thank you, Cami.